Great. Welcome to BASES 2023. My name is Miles Johnson. I created the BASES project in 1994. I'll be talking about that after lunch. In the meantime, we've all had a bit of a rocky road. Michael, you had a bit of a rocky road after you went and phoned somebody, but you could talk about that.
I can talk about that.
Michael also published an extremely important book, which is Spy Hunter. Spy Hunter, the Skype.
Named after Spycatcher.
Welcome to BASES 2023. The Christmas seminars with Michael Shrimpton.
Thank you. Thank you, Miles. Good morning, everybody. Merry Christmas. Good evening to viewers in Queensland, except Nigel Farage, who's still stuck in the jungle, of course. Apologies in advance for the PowerPoint presentation. Microsoft, as you may know, if you do regular speaking, Microsoft have introduced all sorts of colourful ones, and I thought I'd try one of the colourful ones, but then you've got lots of text and photos already inserted, and my IT skills, I'm afraid, are not as good as my intelligence skills. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Oh, splendid, good. Right. Now, I was billed to talk about the Russo-Ukrainian war. First thing about a war. Well, two things about a war. One, before you start a war, you need to think about what you're doing. This is what Adolf Hitler did not do in September 1939. It's always a good idea not to start a war against a superior opponent, and it's always a good idea not to piss off a superior opponent and encourage him to start a war against you. So first rule of war, think about it before you start the war, not afterwards. It's a little bit like litigation. I always say to solicitors and clients, look, I'm unusual as a lawyer. I like to think about litigation before I start it, rather than think about it halfway through. Second thing about war is you've got to think up of a name. Now, the problem with the Ukraine war is that everybody's got a different name for it. But it's very important to give wars a name. It helps historians, because otherwise, they're writing about a war. What are they going to call it? We had this problem with the Afghanistan war. Bush Jr. didn't follow my advice, but my advice was listened to in the White House. I actually went into the White House. I've been into the White House, ladies and gentlemen, never been into Downing Street. Not likely to get into Downing Street either. Well, we shall see. We shall see. You never know. You never know. The Afghan war, I think I wanted to call it the fifth Afghan war. The problem was the Pentagon said, no, you can't call it the fifth Afghan war, Michael, because for us, it's our first Afghan war. I said, yeah, but we've already had four, so if you call it the first Afghan war, it's going to confuse us, because this is our fifth Afghan war. We've had a few going back to the 1880s. And we ended up not calling it anything at all. People call it the Afghanistan campaign. Very confusing. So I, from the start, have called it the Russo-Ukrainian war, which I actually predicted in November 2020, before anybody else, says Michael, blowing my own trumpet. One of the things you need to know about me, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't heard me speak before, I'm terribly shy and retiring. It's very difficult to draw me out of my shell, and I'm always very reluctant to blow my own trumpet. That sometimes nobody else is blowing your trumpet, and you have to blow your own. It's just one of the sad facts of life. Now, the other thing about wars at the moment, because the world is in chaos, is that when you agree to speak about a particular war a few weeks in advance of a conference, you can pretty much guarantee that another war will roll along between the agreement to speak, settling the title, and the actual presentation. So I'm actually going to start by making a few observations about the Gaza war. Now again, coming back to my two rules of war, well, the name to start with, I'm calling it the Gaza war. Other people are calling it the Hamas war. Other people are calling it the Israel-Hamas war. It's the bust-up in Gaza. Second, let's call it the Gaza war. Second, and the whole thing has blown up, of course, since I agreed to speak and we'd settled on the Russo-Ukrainian war. I mean, in fairness, that was the war that was going on when Miles and I had that conversation back at the end of September, beginning of October. And I didn't predict the Gaza war. I didn't think Hamas would be so stupid as to mount a large-scale offensive operation backed by Iran inside Israeli territory in the run-up to Hanukkah on a Jewish festival, pissing off the Israelis. The second rule of war, I said, first get your name right. Secondly, think about the war before you start it. Now, Hamas did not think very deeply about the war before they started it, nor did the Iranians. It's now clear that some of the paraglider pilots, if not all, were in fact Iranian, not Palestinian Arab. They were Iranian special forces on the intelligence available to me, and the Israelis know this. We know that Iran was deeply involved. We also know that Iran is desperately rowing back because Hamas are losing. And the third rule of war, I suppose, is never reinforce a failure. If you're losing, back out quickly. It's one of the rules that Zelensky has not been observing in the Ukraine, which is why his generals are about to settle the war for him. Because the Ukrainian generals aren't stupid. They may look stupid and they may sound stupid, but they're not stupid. And they are talking to the Russian generals. And I guarantee you, ladies and gentlemen, there are conversations going on at the moment between Kyiv and Moscow, probably through back channels, whereby one set of generals is talking to the other set of generals saying, this is a farce, nobody's getting anywhere, let's call this a draw. Similar conversations, incidentally, happened in World War I. Russo-Ukrainian war is a little bit like World War I. It's trenches, it's fixed front, largely fixed front lines, it's huge offensives, costing lots of casualties, lots of expenditure of ammunition, going actually nowhere. A little bit, we all remember the famous scene in Blackadder Goes Forth, and Stephen Fry is examining the strip of earth and saying, what scale is this, in his office? And Tim McInerney, his aide, says, no, that's actual full size. That's the amount of ground that we recovered. What, 6 yards? Although, just coming back to World War I for a minute, as I explained in my book Spy Hunter, Lloyd George was working for the Germans. He had lots of mistresses, they're expensive, he liked champagne, he certainly liked the high, he liked good living, and he was on the German payroll and had been since before World War I. And every time he launched an offensive, Lloyd George, who was initially in charge of munitions, and in World War I you had huge artillery bombardments. What do bombardments require? Shells. He was fixing the shells, making sure that a lot of our shells didn't work. He was particularly keen to make sure the Navy shells didn't work because he didn't want German battleships being sunk. And remember, he was Welsh, not English. And he also told the Germans that we were coming. And that's why the coalition government collapsed after World War I, because the Tories party were briefed in. That's why we have the 1922 committee, named after the meeting at the Carlton Club, of which I used to be a member in 1922. I was a member of the Tory party when it was actually Tory. No longer Conservative, it's now a centrist party, and I buggered off and joined Reform. But the Tory party were briefed in very quietly by some very senior Freemasons who were in very close touch with intelligence. Those Freemasons included the First Sea Lord at the latter part of World War I and the Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, Admiral of the Fleet, Earl Jellicoe, who was a senior Freemason. Beatty wasn't, as a matter of interest. And Beatty, of course, commanded the battlecruiser force at Jutland. Beatty was a dasher, whereas Jellicoe was a thinker. So Beatty tended to get into trouble, and then Jellicoe had to bail him out of it. That's basically what the Battle of Jutland was all about. The investigation was done after the Battle of the Somme in 1916. That's when we discovered that the Germans had advance notice. The Royal Artillery aren't stupid. If you had a brain in the army, and you can, it is possible to have army officers with a brain. If you had a brain in the army, you tended to be sent to the either artillery or intelligence. Why artillery? Because targeting actually is quite complex. You have to have a good understanding of geometry and so on. And so artillery officers tended to be thinkers. Napoleon, if you've seen the film Napoleon, it's quite good. I mean, it's not absolutely historically accurate. French infantry didn't march in line abreast. French infantry marched in columns, which is very helpful because all you had to do was whack the first few people in the column and then they'd have to spread out. But so it's not historically 100% accurate. Napoleon didn't go around blowing off the tops of pyramids. Oh, that's just silly. I don't know why that was stuck in by Ridley Scott, who's a friend of a friend. I probably ought to get a message back to him. And my friend is not very well. That's the friend who worked with Ridley on Blade Runner. If you look at Napoleon was an artillery officer. Napoleon had a brain. Didn't always use it, but he had a brain. And that's why he went in for artillery. And there are some quite good historically accurate scenes of him blowing away demonstrators. The chief of the Metropolitan Police might like to sort of view Napoleon and take that as how do we deal with these Palestinian demonstrators? Well, just follow what Napoleon did, firing a bit of artillery. Once people's legs get blown off and so on, they tend to have second thoughts about continuing to participate in the demo. Now, artillery had worked out that we should have won the Battle of the Somme much more easily than we did. Remember, it was a victory, although it was a pretty Pyrrhic victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The Germans lost, Artillery said this shouldn't have happened. We know the depth of the German trenches. We had done careful observation. The Royal Flying Corps had been all over the trenches. We got lots of photographs. We had spies in no man's land. We had a pretty good idea of the German trench network and how deep it was, and we knew how many shells we needed to completely bust up their trench network. The only problem was that the Germans, having advance notice from Lloyd George, had deepened and hardened their trenches on the very sector that we were going to attack. And it was the only sector of the line that was being deepened and hardened. A very brilliant engineering intelligence officer called Ronald Casey, who later became Lord Casey, the Australian foreign minister, brilliant man, close friend of Sir Robert Menzies, led a team of engineering and intelligence officers who inspected the captured German trenches. And said, well, that's interesting. These trenches have all been concreted in. They're deep, they're hard. No wonder our shells didn't have much of an impact. These trenches were specially prepared. The Germans knew we were coming. That meant there was a spy, either in France or in Whitehall. So there was an investigation, and they ruled out General Headquarters in France as the source of the leak. They pretty much ruled out the French, because we didn't tell the French what we were doing. You never tell the French what you're doing in a war. Because guaranteed somebody in France will be reporting to somebody in Berlin, and Berlin will know what you're doing before you do, almost. So we didn't tell the French everything. It couldn't have come from the French. It didn't come out of GHQ. It had to come out of London. And eventually they worked out that it was indeed Lloyd George. As the Tories briefed in after the war, they couldn't do anything about Lloyd George because the most powerful man in Whitehall was the Cabinet Secretary, Hankey, and he was a German spy. And he figures in, the Cabinet Secretary's role figures in a little bit in the Hamas war. Now, Miles was kind enough to mention Spy Catcher. Spy Catcher was the book written by Peter Wright. I never met Peter, but he was a friend of a friend. He wrote his book Spy Catcher in Tasmania. My book Spy Hunter was partly written in Tasmania in a rather remote rural location from where one could see the opposition approaching should they be in mind to interrupt my writing, as it were. In fact, Spy Hunter Spy Hunter was largely written on a beach in Queensland, on a remote rural location in the North Island of New Zealand, and at a remote rural location in Tasmania. Peter had emigrated to Tasmania after a bust-up with MI5 over his pension. He was a senior MI5 officer, and he blew the gaff on a whole range of MI5 operations. The Cabinet Secretary, Sir Robert Armstrong, was a German spy. Now, most Cabinet Secretaries are German spies. Hankey was a German spy, and when Hankey retired, he had one of his protégés, Sir Edward Bridges, installed as Cabinet Secretary. The office of Cabinet Secretary is extremely powerful, and it's a self-perpetuating oligarchy. So one cabinet secretary who's a German spy makes sure that the next cabinet secretary is a German spy, and so on. So we had a string of German spies as cabinet secretary. And they eventually ended up with a traitor called Sir Robert Armstrong, and he's the man responsible for the attempt. It wasn't really Margaret Thatcher. Margaret trusted him, which was a mistake, and Sir Robert eventually persuaded Margaret that they had to try and suppress publication of Spycatcher. It was a total waste of time because although we don't have a particular tradition in England of freedom of the press, we pretend we do, but we don't, the Americans actually do believe in freedom of the press. It's quite remarkable because I'm an American journalist, remember, in the sense that I write for VT Foreign Policy and do a weekly or 10 daily column, depending on how many wars are going on at any one time. You wouldn't believe how my workload goes up, ladies and gentlemen, when somebody starts a war. I wish people would give me notice so I could plan it and diary it and take things out of the diary and say, right, there's a war going to start next week. I need more time to work on the war. But nobody's ever that courteous. They start the war. The first I knew about the Hamas war was on that morning of 7th of October. Oh, bugger, somebody started another war, and they didn't tell me. Robert Armstrong was a German spy. Nasty piece of work. He actually tried to get the Queen murdered. He was behind the Fagin episode where the police withdrew protection from the Queen and a man ends up in the Queen's bedchamber with a knife. Public won't tell them about the knife. Queen Elizabeth was a very courageous woman. She was a great queen. She was a lovely person. Never met her, but I have seen her. She gave my aunt the OBE once. But she was also very courageous. And she talked down the killer. Killing people at close quarters is not as simple as it's made out to be in films and books. And at the end of the day, she was able to talk Fagin out of killing her. The whole thing was hushed up because the Cabinet Secretary was in the loop and the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir David McNee, was in the loop. Both were traitors. The death penalty was enforced then for high treason, and both should have been hanged. Nicely, of course, slap-up breakfast, a padre, be permitted one glass of beer or wine whilst under sentence of death every evening with their evening meal. So no need to do it nastily, but both should have been hanged. Sir David McNee would then, of course, have been the first Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police to be hanged. And he would have deserved it. Now, the Hamas strategy and the Iranian strategy are last month, 2 months ago now, was, I think, a recreation of the operation that Robert Armstrong ran in 1982 to remove Margaret Thatcher. Target in Israel was Bibi Netanyahu. The target in 1982, which also led to a war, was Margaret Thatcher. So the Cabinet Secretary, working for the Germans, came up with the bright idea. The Germans wanted to offload Margaret because of her views on Europe. They wanted to deepen the EEC. Margaret was in favour of EEC membership, but she was very strongly against any further handing over of powers. Back in 82, the Germans were already thinking in terms of what became the Single European Act in 1985. They knew Margaret would be unlikely to support it, so they wanted to get rid of her. They were going to replace her with Francis Pym, who was a pro-European and, no offence intended, somewhat dodgy. Nice, very gentleman, charming, but dodgy. One of the first things you learn about spies is they can actually be charming. Ebert Heath was a German spy. He was totally grumpy. Ted and I never got on. He was always grumpy. If I said good morning to Ted, he would sort of grudgingly say good morning to you. Most German spies, or most spies, if it comes to that, are charming because it disarms people. It puts them off. Ted was the exception that proved the rule. Now, the idea was that the Foreign Office would tell the Argentinians where our Royal Marines were in the Falklands. The idea was to encourage General Galtieri to invade the Falklands, thereby embarrassing Margaret Thatcher and thereby forcing her to resign. The Cabinet Secretary, being a spy, had lined up the Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Terence Lewin, to give the Prime Minister discouraging advice, saying, sorry, PM, the island's too far away. We haven't got enough ships because of defence cuts. It's out of air range. We've scrapped all our aircraft carriers. We've only got vertical takeoff and landing. The RGs have got supersonic jets. It'll never work. We'll never be able to retake the Falklands, which incidentally was the same view as the Pentagon. I have friends in the Pentagon. I know I've had dealings with, well, the Secretary of the Navy at the time, who was kind enough to have a backup aircraft carrier. Again, public don't know this, but it's not secret. I mean, it has come out, but it's not widely known that the Americans actually had a spare aircraft carrier lined up for us in case one of our, or both of our carriers were sunk, because they looked at this operation in the US Navy and said, geez, there's no way the Brits are going to pull this off. We think they're going to need a spare carrier. They actually had one of their old smaller carriers, which were designed for supporting amphibious landings, lined up. I think it was the USS Iwo Jima. She was a single-screw carrier, small by American standards, about the same size as ours, a bit slow, only did about 15 knots, and she'd kind of been in decommission. You know, she wasn't actually up to scratch, but the Americans quietly refitted her, and the Royal Navy were told, if you lose a carrier, we will transfer one of ours. Which goes to show the depth of the Anglo-American alliance. I mean, nobody else, the French wouldn't lend us an aircraft carrier. The French tried to get some of our ships sunk. The French had people on the Falklands. Remember that attack on HMS Glamorgan with Exocet missiles? They were fired by the French. I mean, they weren't just a French missile, they were fired by the French. The French had a nuclear sub and got people down to the Falklands to actually launch the missiles. Unfortunately for the French, the Americans picked up the signature of they had a thing called the SOSUS network in the Cold War, which was reactivated after during the Madeleine McCann crisis to detect the submarines that were taking people across the Atlantic, including Madeleine. And the SOSUS network picked up the French sub. You know, the Americans said, that's interesting, there's a French nuclear submarine going south. I wonder where that's going in the middle of a war. So the cunning plan was to force Margaret to resign. Unfortunately, the Cabinet Secretary, I mean, cunning plans, as an intelligence specialist, if really comes to me with the cunning plans and we're going to offload a Prime Minister, we're going to do this, that and the other, or we're going to assassinate X, Y, or Z, invariably I say, don't bother. This is just a complex plan and it's just going to come unstuck, a bit like Adolf Hitler's invasion of Poland, or the invasion of the Soviet Union, because Adolf Hitler had fallen for global warming. He was much of a global warming nutter as that nutter was on Question Time on Thursday night, the chap who writes for The Guardian, Moonbat. George Monbiot. That's why the Germans lost World War II, by the way. Einstein was their chief scientific advisor. Never mind what it says in the film Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer and Einstein were working for the Jerrys. Einstein was Germany's chief scientific intelligence. He was the chief scientific advisor to German intelligence. And he'd bought into a theory by a Swedish chemist called Arrhenius, who was not a genius. Arrhenius was a Swedish chemist, knew bugger all about the climate, and he'd worked out or concluded in about 1889 that the increase in global temperatures was linked to the increase in carbon dioxide. And in the whole 1920s and 30s, carbon dioxide was climbing. Einstein said, oh, well, global warming's a fact. This is man-made carbon dioxide, and this is a reflection of industrial activity, and the world is warming. So Admiral Canaris gives the happy news to the Wehrmacht. By the way, boys, we can invade Russia without worrying about general winter. We're not going to have the same problems Napoleon did. You can see it in the movie, everybody dying and eating fellow soldiers and horses dying of cold. And the Germans had minus 50 degrees outside Moscow in December 41. Their willies were dropping off, poor chaps. Not overly sympathetic since they were the Wehrmacht. And they'd probably been putting the willies to rather improper use during their advance across Ukraine and Belarus and so on into Moscow. So one needn't feel desperately sorry for German soldiers with their willies freezing and dropping off, but there we are. The Germans bought into global warming and concluded that we're not going to have a problem in winter. Of course, what happened, because the climate is cyclical, planetary climate is dependent on the sun. the biggest driver of climate is solar output. Solar output goes up, climate warms, planet warms. Solar output goes down, planet cools. And this has been going on for hundreds of millions of years. It's not a new phenomenon. There was global warming in the era of the dinosaurs, for heaven's sake. And the ice sheets, the ice sheets have retreated, they've advanced, they've retreated, they've advanced. The planetary climate is cyclical. And the climate turned. The solar output declined at the end of the 1930s, beginning of the 1940s. By 1941, we were into a phase of global cooling, which lasted until, late 1970s. In fact, the big concern in the 70s was a new ice age. And some of the people who then pushed global warming in the 1970s were talking about a new ice age because they thought that planetary temperatures would continue to decline, forgetting that the sun was the main driver, the sun's solar output is cyclical, and of course the climate turned and entered into a period of global warming, allowing hysterical nutters like the Secretary General of the United Nations, no offence intended, and George Monbiot to go around banging on about global warming. The climate turned, by the way, around about the end of the 20th century, beginning of this century. It was my old friend Sir Patrick Moore, the astronomer, who put me onto that. He said, Michael, solar output is declining. Oh, that's interesting. Temperatures are about to go down. In fact, global temperatures are actually going down. The measurements are going up. That's because somebody's fiddling with the data. But the raw data shows temperatures in a gentle decline, probably for another 20-odd years. Now, the cunning plan back in 1982 was to offload Margaret Thatcher. But, and this is where cunning plans very often go astray, Robert Armstrong wasn't a naval officer and didn't understand ships. What he failed to account for was the fact that the RG ships were mostly old-fashioned American ships like the General Belgrano, which was originally the USS Phoenix, Brooklyn-class cruiser, built in the 1930s, designed in the early 1930s, steam-powered with boilers. And a steam-powered ship is not like my Daimler. You don't just turn the key and the thing starts. The steam-powered ships, you've got to warm the boilers. You've got to light the boilers. You can't just give an order to a steam-powered ship and say, we need you out of harbour in 5 minutes. They'll say, well, give us a bit of notice next time. We can probably be out of harbour by the morning tide tomorrow. The RGs had to light up their boilers. What does that generate? Heat. And as the ship prepares for battle, a steam-powered ship, you get what's called the heat loom. And this is then picked up by satellite on infrared. So the US Navy had access to satellites that were covering the South Atlantic. Now, another thing about satellites, ladies and gentlemen, I don't suppose anybody in this room has ever had a satellite moved. I've had 3 satellites moved, and trust me, whenever you give advice to the Americans saying, I need a satellite over X, always the National Reconnaissance Office, who actually run the birds, will come back and say, does Michael know how much this is going to cost? And always the message goes back to, I know how much it's going to cost. Do you know how limited the fuel supply is on our birds? Yes, I know how limited the fuel supply is on our birds, but this is important. Bin Laden's safe house. Do you want to know where Bin Laden is? Yes. Well, we need a bird over his safe house, so we've got to move a bird. You know, we haven't got a bird overhead, so we need to just shift it a bit. I said, I only want 30 seconds fuel burn. It won't take, we only got a few minutes fuel supply. I said, yeah, but this is important. So I actually had 3 birds moved. I actually never put in a request for a bird to be moved that wasn't honoured. Because after the first bird, which picked up Bin Laden's safe house, the Pentagon, this is marvellous. when Michael says move a bird, he means it. Let's move it. And the satellites, you don't turn satellites on and off. If you think back to Ice Station Zebra, in the old days, Corona satellites, which were the first series of spy satellites, yes, they were time limited because they were using film, chemical film, and the chemical film would only run because there's very limited power and there's very limited film, they were in cassettes, would only run over the target. So if your bird was going over the Soviet Union, the cameras would start whirring when it was going over, you know, wherever, Kapustin Yar, the Soviet ICBM complex at Kapustin Yar. A friend of mine flew a U-2 over Kapustin Yar back in the good old days, did it a couple of times. In fact, it was a very, very popular destination for your U-2 pilot. So we want Kapustin Yar. What's happening in Kapustin Yar? Let's have a satellite overhead and let's run the cameras 100 miles, you know, on the approach to Kapustin Yar, and then the camera will shut off on departure as it goes over the satellite goes over the horizon. Most birds you've got, depends on the altitude of the bird, of course, but you've got a pretty limited window of opportunity to get your pickies. Modern satellites like the Keyhole series are digital. You don't need to turn them off, and they've got plenty of power. So everything keeps going. And most people think in terms of, you know, most people are not space conscious. So they understand the world is round, but they don't really think in terms of the world being round. Your satellite goes round and round. By definition, it's in orbit. That's the whole point. In order to get good pickies, it has to be fairly low. So your average spy satellite is in low Earth orbit, not geostationary, which is 24,000 miles up, and it's going around the planet. And it follows that if your satellite is mainly aimed at the Soviet Union or China, it will pick up all sorts of other interesting places in the planet on its way. You know, it's just going whizzing round and round every so often. And satellites that weren't actually intended or targeted on Buenos Aires and Argentine naval bases suddenly started picking up heat looms. The US Navy warned the Royal Navy. That's why the Navy in '82 were quick off the mark. They had warning. And naval intelligence picked it up and said, that's interesting, the RGs are about to invade the Falkland Islands. The Royal Marines, who the Foreign Office wanted to get killed in order to embarrass Margaret Thatcher, so the Royal Marines were at Moody Brook. The RGs were given all the details about the Royal Marines by the Foreign Office. The Royal Marines actually left their barracks before the invasion. And Margaret was advised not by the Chief of the Defence Staff, who was dependent on his post for patronage from the Cabinet Secretary. So he wasn't a spy, but he was vulnerable to guidance from the Cabinet Secretary. In any event, the Cabinet Secretary knew what his views were. The naval intelligence very cleverly arranged for him to be detained in New Zealand. Now, when I say detained, I don't mean arrest. You can't go around arresting chiefs of the defence staff. But I can't remember what they did. They probably discovered a spare part was missing from his aeroplane or something. Sorry, Sir Terry, the plane's grounded. We're waiting on a spare part from London. It won't be arriving till tomorrow. I don't know exactly how they did it. All I know is they arranged for a very convenient delay. That meant that the naval advice for Margaret Thatcher did not come from the Chief of the Defence Staff, who was a bit of a wimp, no offence intended, but came from Sir Henry Leach. Worst possible choice from the point of view of the Foreign Office and the Germans. Sir Henry was a good old sea dog. He'd actually helped sink a German battlecruiser. He was in charge of B turret on HMS Duke of York in the Battle of North Cape. He was a serious admiral. He was a fighting admiral. He knew what ships were for. They would go and sink the enemy. And he said, yep, of course we can recover the islands. And he was right. The Americans didn't think he could do it. Sir Henry said, yep, we can do it. And he was right. And he had a conversation with a mate of mine called, because no doubt the arguments were put forward, oh, what about the Argentine fighters? But a mate of mine was then Chief of the Air Staff. He's dead now, sadly, a great man, Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir Michael Beetham. And another mate of mine, now also sadly now dead, Air Marshal Sir John Curtis, was in charge of Strike Command. And Michael and John got together and realized, this is interesting. We can bomb Buenos Aires, and we can also hit Port Stanley from Ascension Island. All we have to do is to refuel the tankers that are refueling the bombers. Normally, a tanker refuels a bomber and goes back to base. They came up with the bright idea and said, well, actually, we'll just change the normal tactical operational procedure. We'll have some tankers refueling tankers, not bombers. And if we do that, if we have a little shuttle operation like that, we can actually hit Port Stanley Airfield and we can hit Buenos Aires. Unfortunately, Margaret wimped out, I'm afraid. She didn't normally wimp out, but the War Cabinet wouldn't go with bombing Buenos Aires, which would have been the sensible thing to do. That would have brought the war to a halt even more quickly than it did. But they did get clearance to go and bomb the runway at Port Stanley. Operation Black Buck, Avro Vulcan, great big strategic bomber, 4 engines, 4 Bristol Olympus engines, chucking out 20,000 pounds thrust. If you ever heard of Avro Vulcan takeoff, I've been next to an Avro Vulcan as it was taking off. My goodness me. Huge clouds of smoke, massive noise, waves of noise, wonderful aeroplane. And the Vulcans duly cratered the runway. Military strategists said, well, what was the point of that? Because they didn't knock out any aircraft, and they didn't knock out the runway. All they did was put a few holes in it. But that wasn't the plan. What Michael knew was that if we crater the runway at Port Stanley, the RGs will be forced to operate from bases on the mainland, which means they'll have the same problem the Luftwaffe did in the Battle of Britain. Their fighters will not have enough range to stay over the target area or operational area for sufficient time to do damage, and that is exactly what happened. The supersonic fighters, they were Israeli daggers that the RGs had, were useless because they consume a lot of fuel. They had to fly from Argentina. Had they been able to fly from Port Stanley, they would have been able to engage the Fleet Air Arm. Coming from bases in mainland Argentina, they were next to useless. And in fact, the RGs ended up relying more on their Skyhawks, which had longer range. They were subsonic aircraft, not supersonic. And you wouldn't believe the rate of fuel burn on a supersonic aircraft. You kick, Mach 2, you think, that's marvelous. What a wonderful aeroplane. That's really fast. Yeah, it's about fast for about 10 minutes because the rate of fuel consumption shoots up once you put your afterburners on and you're sticking fuel into the exhaust of the engine and lighting it up. You get lots of extra thrust, but the fuel burn goes up, whoa, massively. Now, if any of you, I don't know how many of you know much about the English Electric Lightning, but our top fighter in the Cold War was the English Electric Lightning. A wonderful bit of kit. Climbed at 50,000 feet a minute. You could get up to 50,000 feet literally in 1 minute from leaving the runway. The only problem was when you got to 50,000 feet, you didn't have much petrol left. It was an aircraft, obviously didn't use petrol, but the Lightning's fuel consumption was exceedingly rapid. You probably had about 20 minutes at operating altitude. Now, sorry, I'm still getting over the flu. Now, because of the warning, because Sir Henry Leach gave the advice, not the Chief of the Defence Staff, Margaret was able to say to Parliament when it resumed on that Saturday morning, another mate of mine, as he became, Sir Michael Foote, was the leader of the opposition. Michael was a patriot. I know he's left-wing. I know I'm marginally the right of centre, but I speak as I find. Michael Foote was a nice man. He was gay. Like me, he was a patriot, and in fact, he'd helped save Winston Churchill's life in World War II because he was the British spy who was in bed, literally, with Beaverbrook, who was gay, and he was reporting Beaverbrook's pillow talk to MI5, and he tipped off MI5 about a plan to assassinate Winston Churchill in May 1941. Result, it was going to happen at Ditchley Park. Churchill didn't turn up, because MI5 had warned him not to, because they'd been told by Michael Foote, who ought to have been in the army, in theory, but wasn't. And he wasn't in the army because he was doing far more, there was absolutely no point having a man as intelligent as Michael Foote peeling potatoes at Aldershot. Michael Foote was doing much better work for the national interest by allowing himself to be shagged by Lord Beaverbrook, if you'll forgive the expression. He sacrificed himself for England. Now, the intelligence is a bit like that. I mean, we live in the real world in the intelligence community. We don't get too worked up about adultery and things like that. That's for bishops to worry about. You don't get many bishops doing intelligence work. The occasional bishop, but not very often. So the whole thing came to a complete screaming halt, and the Foreign Office and the Germans and the Cabinet Office suddenly found that they bought themselves into a war. Exactly the same thing happened in October. Hamas and the Iranians wanted to offload Bibi Netanyahu and decided that if they got German assets inside Mossad, now I know Mossad are penetrated. I've been there, done that, and I've helped spot the two top German assets, DVD assets, inside Mossad, gave their names to the Israelis, had the usual battle. One of them is now dead. I can name him, Shimon Peres, who ended up as Prime Minister. And, of course, I got the word back from Tel Aviv, Michael, you can't be serious. Shimon Peres, he's the Prime Minister. He can't possibly be a German spy. I said, that's why he's the Prime Minister. He was a German spy and manoeuvred in. That's exactly what the Germans did with Lloyd George and Ted Heath. The fact that he's Prime Minister doesn't allay suspicion. The fact that he's become Prime Minister is cause for suspicion. Always have a careful look at the background, whoever ends up in charge of your country. Shimon was working for the Jerrys. Eventually they put... They tapped his telephones and read his emails, and he then made all sorts of silly admissions on a visit to Germany, where he spoke with the DVD, where he's being followed by Mossad and didn't realize. And eventually Mossad realized, oh, Michael's right. Shimon Peres was a German spy, or is a German spy. Now, Mossad had penetrated. Mossad were clearly in on this, and someone in Mossad decided they didn't like Netanyahu, so they suppressed the intelligence which Mossad had of Hamas planning. The Egyptians had told Mossad, about 3 days before, that there was a big operation going down, and there had been all sorts of indications that something big was happening. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when there's a big terrorist operation, you usually get ripples. It's a bit like 9/11. A friend of mine tried to stop 9/11. I was working with him. I was his lawyer. I got him out of Chokey, flown out of RAF Mildenhall in a Gulfstream C5 on the very afternoon that someone turned up at City of London Mags with £100,000 worth of bail money in used fibres in an aluminium briefcase. The CPS had said, "No, Michael, your client is nothing to do with intelligence." I said, "Oh, yes." After the night he was arrested, I got a call from the US Embassy. The deputy director of the CIA was hauled out of a fishing trip in Chesapeake Bay over the weekend. I said, he is heavy-duty CIA, but the CPS wouldn't believe me. They rubbished me, said, nah. You're Walter Mitty, your client's Walter Mitty, you're just making this all up. And I got him out on bail. The magistrate, somebody suggested £100,000 bail. They looked at the bloke in the dock, typical spy, shabby, you wouldn't notice him. That's the whole point if you're a spy. I mean, you don't particularly want to be flamboyant or well-dressed. And they said £100,000, and then I got up and said, that seems a very reasonable figure. And everybody looked at me saying, what the hell's going on here? How come he's readily agreed to £100,000? He should be arguing, I want unconditional bail. £100,000, quite happy with that. Somebody rolls up the next morning with £100,000 in a briefcase, and he's whisked straight off to RAF Mildenhall, where a CIA-owned Gulfstream jet is ready to fly him back to the States. When I say CIA-owned, I mean owned by a front company, owned by the CIA. I mean, it didn't actually have CIA in the American register. It did say ownership CIA. The CIA have a little fleet of Gulfstreams, very useful aircraft for renditions, that sort of thing. And he had been arrested because he was tracking the cash flows into the eastern seaboard for the Al-Qaeda reconnaissance cells for what became 9/11. So that was a ripple. We knew there was lots of cash going through an Arab bank in London into the East Coast. So we know there's a reconnaissance cell operating on the East Coast. So we know there is a big terrorist operation underway. It's in the planning stages, and we know it's going to be the East Coast. And that was about, end of 99. Ladies and gentlemen, that's about all we had on 9/11. Didn't know the target, didn't know the date. The Israelis would have had similar ripples, probably going back for a year, because the Hamas operation was planned at least 18 months. Some say 2 years, and I wouldn't argue with 2 years, but minimum 18 months. And the Israelis started to get whispers of it probably about 12 months. So going back to around about October 22, there were whispers of something big happening, training exercises, communications. Some people who should have been in touch weren't. There were signs of people going underground, communications being shut down so the Israelis couldn't monitor it. There were things that allowed an intelligence officer to say, there is a big Hamas operation underway. Netanyahu was not briefed in, because both the head of Shin Bet and someone senior in Mossad had decided to keep him out of the loop because they wanted him out of the way. So they were backing, somebody else. And it was very much like the 82 operation. Let's embarrass the hell out of the PM, force the PM to resign, and then we'll put in somebody who is more politically amenable. Whole thing, like 1982 in the Falklands, blew up in the bad guys' faces. Instead of resigning, Bibi says, right, we're going to go into Gaza and we're going to smash Hamas. Israelis right behind him, unity government formed, and the Americans unable to stop the Israeli military operation. There, as you all know, because you've all been listening to the news, there's a temporary ceasefire and some hostages are released. Hamas have a major problem. If you ask yourself, why aren't the Israelis so keen on further hostage exchanges? Hamas have a big problem. They're maniacs. They're terrorists. I mean, there aren't many nice terrorists. I have met one nice terrorist, Jerry Adams. Say what you like about Jerry Adams. He's actually quite charming. I like Jerry. I only met once, but he's probably the nicest terrorist I've ever met. But he's the exception that proves the rule. Just like Ted Heath is a grumpy German spy. Most German spies are charming. Most terrorists are pretty nasty people. They do things like rip out women's internal organs through their birth canal. Sorry to say that before lunch, but that's what they were doing on the morning of October the 7th. It was pretty brutal. It was very brutal. It was very nasty, and the Israelis were seriously pissed off. And that whole thing was aimed at Bibi Netanyahu. The hostages, one thing you've got to do with a hostage is keep them alive. I mean, if you're going to go and grab, you shouldn't really be dragging people out of their beds and little kiddies and elderly grandparents, let alone survivors of the Holocaust. I mean, don't kidnap people. It's not nice to kidnap somebody. But if you're going to kidnap them, keep them alive. Hamas went nuts. They started executing their hostages. Very few of the hostages are probably still alive, i.e., the whole ceasefire has ended probably because Hamas have run out of hostages to trade. How many of the hostages are still alive, I don't know. All I do know is that I got intelligence that Hamas were whacking hostages very early on. They were whacking them back in October. Exactly how many have been executed is unclear. And of course, the other thing Hamas were doing was offloading hostages to other terrorist groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, and they then lost control of the hostages. So Hamas might have said, oh, well, we want to look after the hostages because we want X number of prisoners released and we need some leverage over the Israelis. Other groups, even nuttier than Hamas in the Gaza, were whacking the hostages they'd taken off Hamas. Oh dear. So that's where we are with the Gaza war. The Israelis are knocking 7 bells of hell out of Hamas, and they have resumed. And all those commentators who said, no, the Israelis will become under too much international pressure. International pressure, give me a break. The Israelis only listen to the Americans, because it's only the Americans who are giving the Israelis practical help. I mean, we're not. We've got 2 so-called warships steaming up and down off Gaza, but they're not warships. They're not armed. I mean, they've got a few self-defense weapons, but they're Royal Fleet auxiliaries. They're there to extract people. They're not there to put people in. We're not giving the Israelis any military help at all. A little bit of intelligence help, but not much. We're not giving them any cash. We're actually arming Hamas because we're sending aid into Gaza. Now, aid is basically supplies for Hamas. It's a bit like fuel. The UN say, we're short of fuel in Gaza, the hospital's generators are running out. Yeah, but so are Hamas's generators. And who controls the fuel once it gets into Gaza? Hamas. So, you send your fuel in thinking, oh, we're helping keep incubators alive for babies. In fact, all you're doing is keeping Hamas going. So the Israelis have been able, the only people listen to are the Americans, because the Americans are the only people giving him any practical help at all. And the Israelis have got a hold on Biden. Now, why have the Israelis got a hold on Biden? Because Biden was vice president to a bloke called Obama. Remember him? Well, he happened to be born in Kenya. In fact, he was born in what was then the territory of the Sultan of Zanzibar. It was the eastern province of Kenya. And I was one of those intelligence chaps involved in the investigation into the circumstances of Obama's birth. Why me? Well, I used to sit on the Immigration Appeal Tribunal. We had old colonial hands from Africa sitting with us, district officers, people who spoke Swahili. One of them once told an interpreter to stop mistranslating what the interpreter was saying in Swahili. And the interpreter, of course, thought the elderly white man he's a judge, he's not going to know a word of Swahili, I can get away with this. And then the judge started speaking to him in fluent Swahili. Why? Because the judge was an ex-district officer. There was the nearest white man was probably about 100 miles away. He was fluent in Swahili because he dealt with the locals in Swahili. And because I was dealing with Africa hands, we knew about Obama Sr., who was Mau Mau. He was a gun runner for the Mau Mau. He wasn't actually involved in murdering people. He was supplying the guns to the people who were murdering people. And we were keeping pretty close tabs on Obama Sr., and we knew about the birth of this baby in 1960, not 1961. And as an immigration specialist, I was also able to unravel American immigration law and say, well, look, even if the story about his mother is true, she couldn't have transmitted nationality because she wasn't old enough. There was a 21-year-old age limit at the time for unmarried mothers. Oh, dear. And her marriage wasn't valid. Oh, dear. So the Israelis were in on that. And I passed over to Mossad all I had on Obama. So these Mossad have got a nice thick file on Obama, and in turn, they've got the goods on Biden. And that brings on to the Russo-Ukrainian war, because Biden was involved in some very, very messy dealings in Kiev. And what do Mossad have? Some very high-ranking assets in the Ukraine. Why have the Israelis been paying close attention to the Ukraine? Because the Ukraine is armed with nuclear weapons. Not supposed to have them, but they do. The Israelis are not supposed to have them, but they do. The Israelis understand this. They know that nuclear states either fall into two categories: open nuclear states like the UK and the US and Russia, and covert nuclear states who've got lots of nukes but don't tell anybody about them. And those states include not just Israel, but Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Japan. And so the Israelis have been paying very close attention. There was a very nasty arms dealer called Victor Bout, and he'd been selling all sorts of nukes out of Kiev. The Israelis are paying very close attention to that since the breakup of the Soviet Union. So the Israelis know a great deal about what's been happening in Kiev. They know all about the dodgy dealings between Burisma Holdings and Hunter Biden. And they knew Hunter Biden was fronting for his old man. And they knew that some of the cash going into Hunter, about 25%, was actually going to the old man. So they've got at least two major things on Biden: his dealings with Kiev and his the problems with the vice president. Sorry, the problems when he was vice president, because he knew that Obama wasn't allowed to be president. But he went along with it. So that's pretty serious leverage. There's also my case, because Obama was involved in my case. But for a US president to involve himself in a deliberate conspiracy to pervert the course of justice and to lean on American computer companies to falsify computer data in order to get an English intelligence specialist convicted is not a good look. I mean, we're supposed to be allies. All the kit I had was American. In fact, the National Security Agency, for whom I used to supply intelligence, hence getting satellites moved, NSA had to arrange the takeover of SanDisk Corporation, after which SanDisk started telling the truth about a memory stick that the Rozzers thought, well, we'll just get a memory stick, we'll go down to the local shops, we'll buy a memory stick, as long as it looks like the one that Michael has, as long as it's the same colour and it's the same size, we're in the clear. They'll never spot it. Well, I didn't spot it in time for being convicted of having gay porn on a memory stick. The problem was that there were codes on the outside of the memory stick, and SanDisk knew what the codes meant because they put them there. And SanDisk eventually coughed and said, oh, by the way, those codes show data manufacturer, place of manufacture. Michael could not have acquired it. This ain't Michael's memory stick. Oh, dear. And Obama was the man who spoke to very senior people in 2 American companies, one of which was SanDisk, and prevailed upon them to lend their name to a conspiracy to pervert the course of justice in the UK. And the Israelis have got a deep file on that. Indeed, it was the Israelis who first got the recording of my intelligence briefing for the Ministry of Defence. Miles, when would you like me to stop talking? Now, you'll probably say, because I've talked too much, but I thought I'd say something about the topic very quickly before throwing it out for questions. So I've come by a very roundabout route, more roundabout than the route I had to take this morning to avoid puddles on the roads, to the Russo-Ukrainian War, which was the topic. If you've heard me speak before, you'll know I normally don't talk about the topic. I normally say a few words at the end. Now, Russo-Ukrainian War, entirely predictable. I did, in fact, predict it. Unfortunately, NATO, who know me, did not listen to me, nor did the UK, nor did the Pentagon. So we did not do what I would have recommended, which is to start stocking up on smart weapons. The Ukrainians need smart weapons to take down aircraft and take down tanks. And the Ukrainians have got a smaller military than the Russians. The Ukrainians have decided to get themselves into a pissing contest with Russia. Russia's a much bigger enemy. They're going to need a lot of help, and they're going to need, in particular, smart weapons to take out tanks, take out aircraft. We did not ramp up, and they also need offensive smart weapons, cruise missiles, and so on. We did not ramp up production of smart weapons. So when the war started in February 22, we had pretty much the same defense stocks as we had in November 2020. And we didn't even ramp up production after the war started. Now, this was pretty stupid. We've got a war. No, there's a war going on in Europe. It's not a small-scale conflict. It's a full-size war. It's a walking, talking war. And we haven't adjusted our defence posture. Defence expenditure has not gone up, apart from by a few pennies, nor has America's defence expenditure. So we are now where we are. We've given the Ukrainians 5 minutes. We've given the Ukrainians about all the weapons that we can afford to. Result, the Ukrainian General Staff are talking to the Russians because they're going to have to cut a deal. Legal position, messy. The problem was that the Ukraine was about to attack the Donbas republics, which consist mostly of ethnic Russians. The Russians got word in advance of the Ukrainian attack and got their blow-in first. It's not a simple case of Putin being a nasty old dictator, as is portrayed in fact, an elected dictator, so he's not a dictator at all. He's actually won more elections than Rishi Sunak, who's probably unlikely to win any election, in fact. Putin's he's popular in Russia. He gets elected not because he's fiddled he hasn't got elected like Biden. He hasn't had to go around fiddling voting machines. They don't use voting machines in Russia. The votes, all right, the odd vote in Omsk may have gone astray. Somebody may have stuffed a ballot box in Tomsk. It's a Russian election. It's not going to be absolutely 100% clean. Bit much to expect because Russia has no tradition of democracy. But basically, Putin's vote reflects his actually genuine rating with the public. And there's no point telling me the opposition are useless. The opposition are useless in Britain as well. That's why he wins elections. He's not responsible for the state of the opposition, nor is he going around bumping off people. The Germans keep bumping off people in the hope that Putin will be blamed, because Putin is not working for the Germans, and the Germans do not like it. Arguably, the Russian enclaves in the Donbass, although they were not recognized, were sovereign. You don't have to have diplomatic recognition in order to be sovereign. That's not the test. I'm the only judge in England who's actually had to decide in recent times on whether a state is sovereign or not. Diplomatic recognition had not been extended, but I decided that they met the test of sovereignty. That was the state of Puntland, which is what used to be British Somalia. And I had an asylum claim. I was an immigration judge dealing at Cardiff Mags, probably the first time anybody at Cardiff Mags had to decide, is a state sovereign or not? And I said in clear terms, this state meets the test. So not only do I understand the test of sovereignty, I've actually applied it in practice. Probably they were sovereign states. They had recognized borders. They had functioning institutions. They probably met all of the tests of sovereignty. And so arguably what we have is the Ukrainians planning an attack on breakaway republics which had successfully broken away from the Ukraine. I know the Ukrainians say the Donbass republics are part of the Ukraine. Adolf Hitler said Danzig was part of Germany. It had been part of Germany, but by 1939 it had broken away. Ukraine was also developing DNA-specific bioweapons, including in a laboratory under a steelworks in Mariupol, which is why there was a huge bust-up in Mariupol. And the Ukrainians have been participating in armed attacks using high-energy weapons, one of the ground stations of which happened to be at Chernobyl, which is why in the Soviet Union days, because this weapon goes back to the Soviet Union, that's why there was a power station in Chernobyl, because they needed huge amounts of power for these high-energy weapons. That weapon system had actually been operational. It had been targeting the United States, and the Russians knew this. Tanks, very, very important tanks in this battle. All those people who said our main battle tanks are going out of fashion don't know what they were talking about. Keep an eye on this bit of kit. T-14 Armata, that is a screw-up by the software. I'm going to blame the software, not me. It's easy to blame the software. It's probably a screw-up by me. That's not a T-14. That is an Abrams. It says it's a T-14, but it ain't. That's an American Abrams. The American Abrams is just entering service with the Ukrainians. Total waste of time because it's too complex. The Ukrainians don't have any experience of running Abrams tanks. Unless the Americans are slipping in Abrams crews, they're not going to get very much out of their Abrams. Ditto with the Leopard 2. Whispers going around that German Panzer crews are actually operating the Ukrainian Leopard 2s, very possible, probably disguised as mercenaries or volunteers in inverted commas. Nice Panzer, but if you're going into the Panzer market, you're probably not going out to buy a Panzer, but if you're going out to buy a Panzer, don't buy a Leopard 2. Suffers from the main problem all modern German tanks do, a bit like Russian tanks, too much emphasis on mobility, too much emphasis on firepower, not enough emphasis on protection. T-90, that's the main Russian battle tank, a very serviceable bit of kit, same problem as a Leopard, a little bit under-armoured, and that's why the Russians have run into problems. But also, notice the crew hatch. Unlike the Merkava, which is the Israeli battle tank, which is designed for urban operations, to exit a T-90, you have to go through the top, which makes you vulnerable in an urban environment. If you've got snipers and what have you, tank crews going out of the top of the tank, problem. The Israelis have worked out the much better way to get out of a tank is to get out of the back of the tank. But of course, if you've got an exit out of the back of your tank, that means you have to put the engine in the front, whereas most tank designers for the last 80-odd years have put engines in the back. That is a T-14. Keep an eye on this. This is the new Russian main battle tank, surprisingly hasn't featured very much in the war. If the war goes on, which it might, it will feature, trust me. Now, the Russians made the same mistake. Well, Putin wasn't planning an invasion of the Ukraine. He only decided to invade Ukraine because he got intelligence the Ukrainians are going to invade the Donbass republics. So there was no great, deep Russian planning for this war. That's why they had all sorts of logistical problems at the start. I mean, they hadn't been, their kit wasn't even being properly maintained. Now, they should have ramped up production of the T-14. They didn't because they didn't know the war was coming. They are now starting, I'm getting whispers that they are starting to ramp up production of the T-14. It is a stonking main battle tank. It genuinely addresses the failings of previous Russian tanks, and it is a very nice bit of kit indeed. And once the T-14 starts hitting the battlefield, the Ukrainians are going to be in deep doo-doo. Finally, drones. Drones, very, very important in this war. It's a drone war. Lots and lots of drones being used, many of them quite small and quite cheap. But it's the first war in which drones have made a really major impact. Yes, they've been used before, but this is the first big drone war. On that note, Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for speaking. Thank you for listening to me. I hope I haven't bored you too much. Do we have time for questions, or have I completely outstayed my welcome?
We'll take 3 questions.
Three questions. The nice lady in the second row.
Just hold on while I rush. Matthew's going to rush, or am I going to rush?
Ah, right.
Rush. Excuse me, I'll rush.
I don't know you, but you look like a nice lady, so...
She is a very nice lady.
She's a very nice lady.
She speaks more eloquently than any queen ever did.
Oh, thank you for that.
Speak into the mic.
Right, okay. I find all this glib talk of war an absolute abomination, and I feel that there should be far more women in government, and we wouldn't be in this situation. However, that's not my question.
Well, that's probably true.
My question is, have you any idea why David Cameron has now come back into politics in the way he has? I always felt in the past that there was a streak of decency.
Just a question, darling.
Yeah.
No statement.
I just felt there was a streak of decency there, and that he left because he was disgusted by what he saw. But now he's come in a rather dodgy way, and I feel he's probably done a deal with the devil, and I wonder if you knew what that deal was.
Yes, there are deals, and it's very dangerous for Sunak, because basically he's annoyed the right wing of the party. Now, there are big problems with David Cameron, and they relate to a large £50 million bung that was paid to stop or try and stop the Brexit referendum, which came out of the master German slush fund in Geneva. Not directly, because they don't do direct transfers. They do a transfer to another account, and then it goes into another account, and then 50 million quid ended up in England. Now, I'm not saying any more, because I can't say any more, because I'm bound, people listening in Queensland and Japan and elsewhere need to understand that I'm bound by the English laws of libel, and without the tear-off sheets and physical hard proof, which you never get, because intelligence agencies never hand out proof any more than the Bank of England hands out gold bars. There's not much more I can say. In fact, that's as far as I can go. But there's a big problem with Cameron, and bringing him back was a very dangerous move. And I don't think Rishi had been briefed in on the 50 million. I was partly responsible for Brexit because I briefed in a treasurer of the Tory party about 25 million quid that had found its way into the Tory party accounts, went to talk to a former treasurer who Cameron had pissed off, and I said, look, I think this is where the money, there's a bung, 25M, it's come out of Tokyo, Nomura Bank in Tokyo, back deal transfers, it's linked into a HS2, sorry, the Swiss account wasn't involved in that bung. Sorry, I'm getting so many bungs.
I want to speak into this mic.
Yeah.
Strangely, your audio is just being interfered with.
Good heavens. So many bungs. Sorry, that particular bung had come out of Nomura Bank in Tokyo. It was linked to a HS2 contract, which is why they can't cancel HS2. Now, the CIA picked up the bung, told MI6, when Cameron, who backed the prosecution of me, in fact invited one of the officers involved to Downing Street, which was a huge mistake, because he took a selfie outside the door. If you're invited to Downing Street, what do you do these days? You have someone take a selfie of you standing by the policeman outside the door. Cameron didn't know there was a selfie, didn't realise there was a photographic record of said Ross's appearance at Downing Street. Rossa, of course, was boastful and showed me the picky, and I thought, that's interesting. Cameron is backing the prosecution, which he was. Now, Cameron, having backed my prosecution, MI6 were trying to stop it because MI6 knew about the 2 nuclear warheads. MI6 were frantic. They didn't want the news to come out that the Germans had smuggled 2 nuclear warheads into London, A, and B, they're gentlemen, and weren't prepared to see another gentleman get sunk for something he'd already done, and C, I'd passed the odd snippet of intelligence to MI6 over the years, so I wasn't exactly a stranger to them. They weren't having any of this nonsense. CIA told MI6 because there was a currency swap out of dollars into sterling, and the CIA picked up the currency swap, and MI6 then arranged to brief me in the Red Lion pub in Wendover. It's known in the intelligence community as the Red Lion Talks. There were a series of briefings on this bung. Treasurer of the Tory party found the bung in the accounts, disguised as a loan, which is what I told him would probably have happened. I said, he said, no, that can't happen, Michael, because you need a bank to be involved. I said, the bank is involved. A dodgy bank, if that's not a tautology. And he then briefed in a chap called Boris Johnson. You may have heard of him. Cameron called the referendum thinking he had enough goods on Boris over his messy personal life to prevent Boris from campaigning for leave, which is what he wanted to do all along. With the information that came from CIA to MI6, MI6 to me to former Treasurer of the Tory Party, former Treasurer of the Tory Party to Boris, the former Treasurer of the Tory Party being the Treasurer of the Vote Leave campaign. Oh dear, how sad, never mind. Boris was able to resist the blackmail pressure from Cameron and campaign for leave. Now that may all come out in the wash, particularly in the middle of a general election campaign. Certain media outlets are aware. There we are. I hope that answers your question. I talk glibly about war because that's one of my jobs, is following wars. So, you know, yes, well, I hate war too. I'm a man of peace. I greatly prefer peace to war. Apart from anything else, wars mess up my diary. But I have to deal with facts. Intelligence community, we deal with facts. We have 2 wars going on at the moment. Neither war should have been started. If anybody had come to me before starting the war, I'd have said, don't. Oh, lots of money laundering in the Ukraine. Kyiv, oh, money laundering out of Kyiv, definitely. Oh, yes, lots of money laundering in Kyiv.
Any other questions, please? Jane, you're not on mic. Nobody can hear you.
Hi. I'd just like to find out a bit more about you said the DNA bioweapons in Ukraine. DNA bioweapons.
Oh, yes.
I'd just like to find out a little bit more about that.
Yes. Now, the Ukrainians, with the assistance of some crazy nutters in the United States, not unconnected with certain crazy nutters who were developing COVID and helping the Chinese, were developing bioweapons designed to kill ethnic Russians. Russian DNA is different to Ukrainian DNA. It's not wildly dissimilar, but the theory is that you can have a bioweapon that will only kill Russians, not Ukrainians. Now, the whole thing is mad. Bioweapons are weapons of mass destruction. The Russians would be bound to find out about it sooner or later, and that would be pretty likely to lead to war. And the Russians have got nuclear weapons. An extremely bad idea. Also, very, very difficult to do, and it doesn't look as though the Ukrainians actually got to where they wanted to be. They were, of course, getting help from the Germans, who are very into bioweapons and have been since the 1940s, when Dr. Mengele was running their bioweapons program. That's what he was doing at Dachau concentration camp. AIDS, by the way, is a bioweapon. HIV is a bioweapon. It was developed by the Germans. It was something they started work on in 1940. I'm the man, by the way, who made the link between German intelligence and HIV, because I discovered that in 1940, the Abwehr, German intelligence, had been asked to arrange for the importation of 1,000 rhesus monkeys into Germany for Dr. Mengele. That's really interesting, because there's a link between rhesus monkeys and HIV, and I can guarantee you, ladies and gentlemen, that the Abwehr were not arranging in the middle of a war for 1,000 rhesus monkeys to be imported into Germany in order for them to be displayed at the Berlin Zoo. One mating pair of monkeys, yes, not 1,000 monkeys. No, they were for medical research. That was
one
HIV.
final question. Anybody? One question. Brief, very brief. Anybody got a question? Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much, Michael Shrimpton. Round of applause for Michael Shrimpton. And do you have any copies of your book available for sale, for money?
I'm afraid I haven't bought copies of the book with me, no.
Where do people
June
get
Press,
your book?
You can get it from June Press. June Press, look them up online, junepress.com. Keith at June Press will happily sell you a copy of the book.
June as in?
June as in the June referendum in Denmark. It goes all the way back to the June referendum.
Spelt the same way as June?
Spelt as in the month of June, yes.
Okay, thank you very much,
Thank
Michael
you.
Shrimpton.